Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking into a new initiative from the Department of Homeland Security. It's causing quite a stir.
Yeah, it's this offer basically $1,000 plus help with travel costs for people who agree to self-deport from the U.S.
$1,000. Okay.
And to really get a handle on this, we've looked at quite a few sources. Statements from the American Immigration Lawyers Association, ALA articles from places like Truth Out, Politico, CBS News, Notice 2,
Yeah.
and also insights from the ACLU, plus a report from the Carsey School of Public Policy that digs into the economic side of mass deportations.
So quite a range of perspectives. Our aim today really is to unpack what this offer actually is, look at these different views on it, and think about the potential fallout for the people involved, obviously, but also for the wider economy.
Right.
So let's start with the offer itself. What are the specifics? What did DHS actually announce?
Okay, so the core is that $1,000 stipend and the travel help for people who choose to leave voluntarily. And the main tool they're using for this is the CBP Home app. Ah, the app. Okay.
Yeah, people use the app to sort of signal they intend to leave, and then they have to use it again later to confirm they've actually departed.
And that's when they get the stipend.
That seems to be the process, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Confirming departure via the app triggers the payment.
And how is DHS framing this? What's their rationale?
Well, they're presenting it as a more dignified way to leave. That's the phrase they use.
Dignified.
And they're also really pushing the cost-saving angle. They estimate the self-deportation route could save something like 70% compared to traditional forced deportation.
70%. That's
Right.
huge. What does traditional deportation cost typically?
They put the average figure at around $17,121 per person. So yeah, the potential savings look significant on paper.
$17,000. Wow. The Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, she commented on this too, didn't she?
She did. Secretary Noem basically said that using the app to self-deport is the best, safest, and most cost-effective way to leave.
Best, safest, and most cost-effective. Strong words. And there's another angle too. DHS is suggesting that if you participate in this program, it may help preserve the option for you to come back legally later on.
May help preserve the option. That sounds a little vague.
It does, and that's where some of the criticism comes in, which we'll get to. But yeah, the pitch is money now, a smoother exit, and maybe an easier path back later.
It almost sounds too good to be true, which always makes you pause.
Exactly. And DHS has said they've already helped some migrants get plane tickets, apparently for departures within just 2 weeks. They mentioned one person already went back to Honduras from Chicago using this.
So it's already happening.
Seems so. And they also stressed that people actively using the app to arrange their departure will be deprioritized for detention and removal while that's in progress.
Okay, so on the surface, it looks like a practical cost-saving measure.
Great call.
But as you hinted, there are concerns. Let's dig into those. ALA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, they had some strong words.
Very strong. They put out a warning calling this offer a deeply misleading and unethical trick.
Wow. A trick.
That's their term. Their bottom line advice is don't accept this offer without talking to an immigration lawyer first, period.
And what are their main worries driving that warning?
A big one is that people might misunderstand the implications. They might hear easier path back and not grasp the potential negative consequences for their actual ability to return legally in the future.
Like they might be signing away rights without realizing it.
Potentially, yes. They're worried people won't understand the legal risks. And ALA even mentioned reports that some immigration courts might be posting inaccurate info, sort of suggesting self-deportation is fine without fully explaining the legal pitfalls.
That's worrying if official channels are giving bad advice.
Especially for people without lawyers who are relying on that information.
Right. Aaron Reckland-Melnick, he's with the American Immigration Council. He also weighed in quite critically.
He did. He was very direct. He basically said DHS's suggestion about preserving the option to return legally is often a lie.
A lie. That's
Yeah.
blunt.
Yes. He argues it could actually lead to worse outcomes than fighting your case in court. His point is, if you're already in immigration proceedings and you just leave under this program without formally resolving your case, you can still be ordered deported in absentia. So you leave thinking it's okay, but then a deportation order gets issued behind you.
And that deportation order causes problems later.
Huge problems. Having that formal order makes it incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to come back legally. So this dignified departure could actually sabotage your whole case.
So you could accidentally lock yourself out permanently by taking this offer.
That's the risk Reichlin-Melnick highlights. There were also questions raised about the legal authority for these payments. Where's the money coming from?
Good question.
Yeah, Reichlin Melnick pointed to a specific part of the law, 8 U.S.C. Section 1260. It talks about using funds to deport aliens falling into distress who want to leave.
Okay, distress funds.
But here's the kicker. That same law includes a near total ban on reentry for anyone deported under it.
Wait, so if that's the law they're using?
It directly contradicts the idea that self-deporting this way might help you come back later. That law is designed for specific, dire situations, and it usually slams the door shut on legal return.
That seems like a massive contradiction.
It really does. It raises questions about transparency and what people are actually agreeing to.
Tina Vasquez, writing for Prism, she looked at the tech angle, the CBP Home app itself.
Yeah, she sort of connected it to the Biden administration's wider push for using tech in immigration. She noted that sometimes these tech solutions end up creating new hurdles for immigrants, even if that wasn't the intention.
Like unintended consequences of the tech itself.
Right. And she worried about how this app, combined with the $1,000 lure, might pressure people into a choice that isn't really in their long-term best interests. She also made an interesting political point, how the reaction from, say, right-wing media might have been very different if a Democratic administration had rolled out a cash for deportation program.
That's a fair point about political framing. What about the ACLU? Their focus is usually on rights.
Exactly. The ACLU's core message is that constitutional protections, like due process, apply to everyone in the U.S., regardless of immigration status.
Due process meaning a fair hearing, essentially.
Right. A fair legal process before you can be removed. And they pointed out some stark numbers, like back in 2013, something like 83% of people deported never even had a hearing before a judge.
83%. That's staggering.
It is. And they also mentioned the billions spent on immigrant detention. So their concern here is that this offer might encourage people to waive their right to due process, maybe without fully grasping what they're giving up.
So a lot of red flags from legal experts and advocacy groups about fairness, transparency, and long-term harm to individuals.
Definitely.
But you mentioned earlier, some Republicans actually like this idea.
Yes, on Capitol Hill, there's been some enthusiasm from Republicans. The main driver seems to be the potential cost savings for the government.
The fiscal angle again?
Pretty much. They see it as cheaper than detention and lengthy deportation proceedings. Representative Dan Muser, for instance, was quoted saying something like, "I kind of like it. It's a little bit out of the box. And frankly, it's a better return on investment than the present situation."
Return on investment. Okay, so a clear focus on the bottom line there.
It seems to be the primary appeal for those supporters.
Interesting contrast. Let's shift gears then to the broader economic picture. That Carsey School of Public Policy report looked at the impact of deportations on the U.S. economy, right? Not just the government's budget.
Exactly. And their findings are really important context here. They looked at past deportations and found, well, negative impacts on U.S.-born workers, too.
How so?
For example, they studied the Secure Communities program, which ran from about 2008 to 2015 and led to, hundreds of thousands of deportations. Their analysis suggested this actually reduced the employment share for U.S.-born workers slightly, by about 0.5%.
Reduced employment for citizens. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but that's what they found. And it also slightly decreased their hourly wages by about 0.6%.
Did they look at other historical periods?
Yes, they went way back to the Great Depression deportations of Mexican immigrants, 1929 to 1937. Again, the idea was maybe it would free up jobs, but they found small decreases in U.S.-born employment and either flat or negative wage effects.
So removing workers didn't help the remaining workers back then either.
Didn't seem to. And another example, removing Mexican farm workers in 1964. Didn't really boost jobs or wages for domestic farm workers. What happened instead? Employers turned to machines or just grew less stuff.
Fascinating. What about more recently? Arizona had those tough anti-immigrant laws years ago.
Right, around 2007, 2008. I wasn't deportation exactly, but the laws pushed an estimated 40% of unauthorized immigrants out of the state.
And the economic effect.
According to Moody's Analytics, it actually shaved about 2% off Arizona's GDP annually between 2008 and 2015, beyond the effects of the recession, and total employment dropped 2.5%.
Wow, a 2% drag on GDP every year.
Yeah, and another study on Arizona by Bond and others found it didn't help the remaining low-skilled legal workers either. In fact, it seemed to reduce employment and increase unemployment for them.
So removing immigrant workers actually hurt low-skilled legal workers in that case.
That's what the study indicated, yeah. Particularly non-Hispanic white men, interestingly.
That really challenges the simple they take our jobs narrative. So, based on this history, what do economists project if there were large-scale deportations now, nationally?
The projections are pretty stark, honestly, mostly negative. One economist, McKibben, estimated just this year that deporting 7.5 million unauthorized workers, a huge number, obviously could cut U.S. GDP long-term by 6.2%.
6.2%. That's trillions of dollars.
About $1.7 trillion at today's levels, yeah. And fewer hours worked overall. Even deporting a smaller group, say 1.3 million, could still mean a 1.1% GDP hit or $300 billion.
Still massive numbers.
Yeah.
Any other projections?
Edwards and Ortega did work back in 2016. They estimated deporting all unauthorized immigrants could cut GDP by 1.4% short term, rising to 2.6% long term. That adds up to maybe $5 trillion in lost output over a decade.
A trillion.
And they highlighted huge impacts in specific states, like California, and industries like agriculture, construction, hospitality, potentially losing 10% to 18% of their workforce.
Industries that rely heavily on that labor.
Exactly. Another estimate from the Bipartisan Policy Center suggested removing all current and future unauthorized immigrants could shrink GDP by 5.7% nationally.
It seems like a consensus among these economic studies about significant negative impact.
It does point that way. Other studies calculated effects like increased unemployment for U.S.-born workers if you remove half the Mexican unauthorized immigrants, or huge economic shrinkage in a state like Texas, maybe 10% of its economy.
And what about the government's finances?
Yeah.
Beyond just the cost of deportation itself.
Well, less economic activity means less tax revenue. Edwards and Ortega estimated an $860 billion federal revenue loss over 10 years from deporting everyone.
Because the economy shrinks.
Right. Plus, you lose the taxes those immigrants were paying, estimated around $100 billion a year. And then there are the direct costs of deportation. Estimates range from $100 billion to over $300 billion just for the removal effort, plus ongoing enforcement costs.
So the initial cost savings per person that DHS mentioned could be swamped by these much larger economic costs and revenue losses.
That's certainly what these economic analyses suggest, yes. It's a much bigger picture.
And we haven't even talked about the impact on families yet.
No, there's research on that too. Warren and Kerwin looked at mixed status households where you have citizens and unauthorized members living together. They estimated mass deportations could cut the median income of those families by almost half, 47%. Devastating.
47% drop in income for those families. And finally, there was a connection made to inflation.
Yes, economists noted that when we had less immigrant labor during the pandemic, it actually contributed to inflation. Fewer workers meant less supply of goods and services. And conversely, more immigration recently seems to have helped ease inflation. So the implication is, if you suddenly remove a lot of workers through deportation,
You could actually fuel inflation.
that's the concern, yes, by shrinking the labor supply again.
So, putting it all together from the economic side, while this stipend looks like a potential saving on the deportation process itself, the wider economic studies suggest that policies leading to mass departures, voluntary or not, could have really severe negative consequences for the whole U.S. economy, GDP, jobs, wages, even inflation.
That's a fair summary of what the economic research indicates.
We also had some specific points outlining the risks tied directly to this kind of self-deportation stipend system. Can you recap those quickly?
Sure. A key one is safety. Many people flee their home countries because of violence or persecution. Sending them back, even with $1,000, could put them in real danger.
A critical point. What else?
Loss of established life. People build lives here, jobs, communities, families. Reintegrating elsewhere is incredibly hard. Then there's the potential for fraud in the system, people trying to game the stipend.
Okay.
Unintended economic effects, too, sudden labor shortages in certain areas or industries if many people leave at once, and just general legal uncertainty about how this whole stipend thing actually works and its authority.
And a human rights angle?
Yeah, the question of whether it's truly voluntary participation or if the financial incentive amounts to a form of coercion, especially for people in desperate situations.
So when you take everything into account, this self-deportation offer, framed perhaps as a simple solution, it just seems riddled with really complex and serious issues.
That's right. You've got major legal and ethical questions swirling around it. Potential harm to vulnerable individuals who might take the offer without full understanding. And then these significant risks to the wider U.S. economy based on quite a bit of historical data and economic modeling.
That doesn't sound like a silver bullet.
Far from it. Based on this analysis, the consistent theme across these different perspectives, legal, ethical, economic, points towards potentially negative outcomes, both for the individuals and the country overall. The long-term impacts remain really uncertain.
This deep dive, it really highlights the sheer complexity, doesn't it? And the potential pitfalls of what might seem like a straightforward initiative.
They've looked at the administration side, cost savings, a dignified process,
Uh-huh.
but weighed against that are these very serious warnings from lawyers and advocates about misinformation, about due process rights being potentially undermined.
Right.
And then the economic data just paints a picture where any short-term budget savings could be dwarfed by much larger economic damage, lower GDP, fewer jobs, potential inflation.
It really forces you, the listener, to consider what this initiative signals about where immigration policy might be heading. Is it about efficiency above all else? And what's the government's responsibility here? To make sure people truly understand the choice they're making, the rights they might be giving up, the potential long-term consequences of taking that $1,000.
That's the crucial question, isn't it? This is clearly just the beginning of trying to understand the full impact of this policy.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining me to unpack all of this today.